Good evening, everyone. My name is Cedric Geffen. I'm the president of March of the Living Australia, and it gives me absolute pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to another of our many online events, all related to the two core pillars of our educational mission: learning more about the Holocaust and about Israel to ensure a better understanding of the past in order to create a better future for all. And tonight's session will no doubt greatly add to this wonderful repertoire. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we work and live, and on which this online event is being hosted today. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our guest of honor and presenter, Jemima Montag. Jemima, as most of you may know, is Australia's premier female race walker, who at only 23 years old has already secured a dominant Commonwealth Games gold and Olympic and World Championships top 10 finishes. Jemima was selected for her maiden Olympic berth in Tokyo, where she placed a stunning 6th in the oppressive Japanese heat in Sapporo, clocking 1 hour, 30 minutes and 39 seconds. Her 6th place was the second highest in Australian Olympic history, and at the end of this race, there was an emotional moment where she pointed to the sky as she crossed the line, later revealing that it was a tribute to her late Nana, a Holocaust survivor that she'll tell us all about, who inspired Jemima's incredibly brave performance. Jemima is currently an IOC, International Olympic Committee, young leader for 2021-2024, where she is working on Project Play On, which is all about inclusivity in sport, especially for girls and young women. Jemima's terrific form has continued in 2022 with two 10,000-meter walk personal bests in January. Then in February, she broke Jane Saville's 18-year-old 20-kilometer walk Australian record, clocking 1 hour, 27 minutes and 27 seconds. She also claimed the 10,000-meter walk national title and Oceania Championship. I hope I haven't left anything out, Jemima. And so now, without further ado, it's over to Jemima. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here with you tonight to share this story. As has been said already, I'm Jemima, and tonight, for the first time ever, actually, I've told this story socially to family and friends, but never in such a formal setting. So bear with me, I'll give it my best go, and really looking forward to your questions when we open it up at the end. So if I can get to the next slide, here we go. So we've already heard a little about who I am. So I'm an Olympic athlete, 2 times Commonwealth Games gold medalist. I'm currently in my first year of postgrad medical school as well, trying to pass some exams tomorrow. So we'll see how that goes. And being the granddaughter of 2 actually Holocaust survivors has always felt really central to my identity. But up until the last year and a half, I never truly knew what Nana's story was, because understandably, she didn't want to talk about it very much with her own children, and then even less so with her grandchildren. So it was only after her passing that I actually went over to my auntie, her first child's house, and we were sorting through love letters and birth certificates and passports and photographs, and we found a 3-hour tape that she recorded for the Schindler's List film, because her father was actually on Schindler's List, and we found some love letters. The problem was that the letters were all in Polish. And so even though my dad can speak a tiny amount from his upbringing, none of us could read the letters, and we really wanted to know what was inside them. And so I've got a picture of the letter here for you to see. On the left-hand side of your screen, that's a big journal entry that my auntie just showed me 2 days ago, that she sat down and wrote. She wrote everything she could remember about her story, and it says, "For my children and grandchildren," at the top, which was actually quite emotional to find. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, that's one of the love letters that we found between my grandma and grandpa after the war had finished. And so, to give you a quick synopsis of the story before I wind back to the beginning, Nana was about 13 years old when the war began, and she managed to survive with her sister and her father, so quite a lucky outcome. And she fled to Paris, and someone else was living a parallel story. He also survived the Holocaust, but with no family. He fled to Melbourne, and they ended up being my grandparents. These love letters are between the two of them. And if you want to find out how, I guess you'll have to stay tuned in. So, how I'm going to structure this presentation is in 6 chapters, and then I'm going to extract some lessons at the end. So the way that I've broken this letter into 6 parts is using each of the names that Nana was known as in different chapters of her life. So when she was a child, she was known as Judita Joachimsman. Through the Holocaust, she was known as her number, A26293. She was then Judith Zaborowski in Paris. After the death of her first husband, she was Judith Montag. Then she was Mum, and finally she was Nana Judy. So those will be the titles of the 6 parts of this story as we make our way through the translation of this love letter. So how did I get it from Polish to English? Well, I actually was able to send this letter over to a Polish training partner of mine, who's bilingual, and he was able to put it into English for us. And it was the first time the family had read these letters, which was really special. And so each time I clicked the next slide, a new paragraph of the letter will be revealed in English. So let's start. So I guess the first chapter, Judita Joachimsman, was how she was born. And the start of her letter to her eventual husband and my grandfather reads, "Dear Mr. Richard, I read your letter with keen interest, written so warmly and directly that at the end I had the impression it came from someone I knew for a long time. Following the first instinct of my hesitance, I write back immediately, and I think that this is the best proof of my sincere interest. I imagine that Mr. Stashek, despite his best intentions, could not tell you much about me. We know each other so briefly that I should introduce myself here more closely. I come, as you already know, from Krakow, or rather strictly speaking, from Woliczka, where I spent the carefree years of my childhood." So Nana was born on the 21st of August in 1928 in Woliczka, this town 13 kilometers southwest of Krakow in Poland. And it was the roaring 20s, so manufacturing industries were growing, and her father, Roman, bought a share in an import-export business. She described her family in this 3-hour recording for Schindler's List as being very well assimilated in Woliczka. They would go to shul just for the high holidays, traveling most of the way by horse, which was a bit cheeky, and the final 10 minutes by foot, so no one would suspect anything. She said in the recording that she felt like a Pole first and a Jew second. She was quite happy and well liked at school, recalling that the teachers and children were mostly kind, even the non-Jews. And her best friend, Helena, who was not Jewish, loved coming to the Joachimsman's apartment after school for a slice of Victoria's cake, so Victoria's Nana's mum. But a year before the war began, things started to change. She said that Jewish families started fleeing Poland, but Victoria, her mother, felt obliged to stay, and her father, Roman, couldn't afford to close his business. They also didn't own a car, which made the logistics of running away to bordering countries near impossible. So reflecting on this part of the story, I'm wondering how Nana would have felt in that moment as a 13-year-old. Would she have believed in luck, that she could surrender her fate to some higher power? Did she feel compelled to be sneaky and play her cards right? At such a young age, could she really comprehend life and death? So we'll have to read the next section of the letter to find out what happened next. So the next paragraph of the love letter says, the first sad memories are evoked in the year 1940, the deportation from Krakow, a 2-year farm stay with my grandparents on a farm near Golice, and the loss of my mother on the 14th anniversary of my birth. So, as the story goes, life went on, but it also changed dramatically. After Nana's 14th birthday, there was talk that there was something about to happen in their town because there were police and German SS soldiers everywhere. Some non-Jewish Polish family friends of the family offered to hide Nana and her sister in their walk-in pantry until this was over. People figured that it would be over in a week or two. So she followed this non-Jewish family friend. She ripped her star off, knowing that this was a risk, in an attempt to save her life. And they traveled mainly by foot to get to this safe house, as it was too dangerous to go on the train. And actually in her recording, she says that her dark hair and round Semitic eyes were an instant giveaway that she was Jewish, so she had to do a lot of hiding to get to this pantry. She describes the pantry as being cramped and terrible. She, along with her sister and one other boy, were really trying not even to breathe. And then on the 29th of August, all the Jews from the town were hoarded onto trains. The Germans asked everyone how old they were, and Roman, Nana's father, was 47. He looked quite young, but to the Germans, 47 was ancient. He wasn't going to be of any use to them. So they told him, you know what, you've worked long enough in your life, now you go for a rest. And they gestured for him to go to one train that he and his wife put 2 and 2 together and realized where that train was going. He followed the orders, but after taking a few steps, Victoria, Nana's mum, had a moment of clarity. And she said to her husband, now is your chance. You need to run into the group of people who were selected for work on the other train. And the next time they ask you, you must say you were at least 5 years younger. So without hesitation, Roman and his friend ran across to the train selected for work. Being a few years older than her husband, Victoria was taken away, presumably to a death camp. And that would be the last Roman saw his wife. And what a heroic final act she did for him to recognize that opportunity and say, you look young enough, you have work left to give, you need to run to the other line. The next line in the love letter reads, by some fortunate coincidence, we were among the handful of chosen ones in a labor camp near Krakow. So Nana and her sister Ruth, along with their father Roman, ended up being sent to Plaszow, a Nazi concentration camp 10 kilometers from Krakow. And an example sort of day in the life that she documented in these journals was that once the sun was up, they were marched 2 kilometers down the road to a factory for cable work. Sometimes on this 2-kilometer walk, they were forced to sing German marching songs, the same music that was played during public hangings. And this really confused Nana. She knew the Germans were musical people. She knew they were great writers, but what they were doing seemed completely at odds with this beautiful culture she thought she knew. The cable factory in Plaszow was expansive with a variety of jobs to do. Ruth, Nana's sister, worked on a machine that spun cables, covering them with a silk-like material for insulation. This was too difficult for Nana. She found a job that involved holding a cable and checking for faulty insulation. When electricity shot through the cable in her hand, a gap in the insulation would cause a burn. And if she felt this, she was to stop and repair it by hand. Sometimes the Polish workers would give her hints to make the cables faulty. After all, they didn't want to lose their country to the Germans. If Nana overlooked a dysfunctional section of insulation, the cable wouldn't work properly. So she tried to do this often, knowing that if she was caught, they'd kill her. It was a fine balance between playing by the rules and taking clever risks. And at the end of the workday, they were marched back to Plaszow camp, received a small nighttime meal. And the highlight of their day would be hoping to go to the dividing fence and meet their father Roman between the men's and women's barracks just to say hello. They would have a simple exchange acknowledging that another day had passed and maybe the next day would bring something better. They were just hoping that the war would finish soon. And they knew that the Russians were marching forward and hoped that they'd push quickly, but there was lots of territory to cover. All the while, Nana explains that Ruth, her sister, was the optimist. She always would say, no matter what they do, we are going to survive. The yang to that yin in the sisterhood was Nana, who was the self-confessed pessimist. She reflected that without her sister Ruth, she would never have survived, and their unbreakable bond would create several more miracles. The next line in the love letter reads, "At the end of the war, however, I wandered as far as Hamburg, previously visited Auschwitz and Ravensbrück." So, as the story went, Nana's father ended up on Schindler's List through a man, Mr. Goldberg, that he'd worked with, but he wasn't clever enough or sneaky enough to ask, would his two daughters please be put onto the list? And so he went off to work with Oskar Schindler, and Nana and Ruth were taken to Auschwitz next. She didn't know what this meant, what it was, but she said that her birthday in August kept coinciding with horrible events, which is probably why she never enjoyed celebrating it for her 77 post-war years, because it only brought back bad memories. So on her 16th birthday, August 1944, we are now, Nana and Ruth were packed onto a train, 100 people per carriage, and taken to Auschwitz. The thick smoke trickling out of the chimney was their first clue as to what would happen next. Again, the soldiers split them into two groups, one smaller group of women and younger children, another group with Nana and Ruth. This time, the soldiers didn't ask how old they were, they simply went by observation. And at 16, Nana looked healthy enough to work. The groups were taken to two separate barracks. They were sure that one was for the gas chamber and one was not. This barrack was different to camps Nana had seen before. It had a concrete floor and simple walls. They were told to sit on the floor and wait from morning to late afternoon. And as each hour passed, the fear that they may be the unlucky group grew. Soon they were ordered into bathrooms. They had to strip and give all of their clothing and jewelry in. Nana had some copper rings from previous boyfriends from her time in the cable factory. They may have been worthless, but she didn't want to part with them, so she hid them in her mouth. When she was questioned by the German woman leading the barrack, the rings in her mouth were seen. One beating from the German and she spat the rings out. They were thrown against the wall as the woman yelled, "You stupid idiot, what were you keeping those for?" To further humiliate the naked women, a man came into the bathroom to shave them clean. He told them not to worry, that he was fairly sure they'd live and that they'd soon receive a shower with water, not gas. So one can only imagine the relief and joy that washed over the women when water really did come streaming out of the shower heads. And once they were clean, they received a striped frock. 8 women received only a simple blanket as they'd run out of clothing. And next came the tattoo, A26293 for Nana. From time to time, someone would come from Auschwitz looking for people who had skills for work, and Ruth told Nana, if anyone comes to take us to work, we will say we know how to do it. Nana wasn't sure about this tactic. They will kill us. Here, we won't survive. We weren't put in the gas. All we have to do is stay healthy and useful. So Ruth was really Nana's guidepost, her strength, the only reason she could continue through the atrocities. In mid-January 1945, the sisters were sent marching from Auschwitz. What has since become known as Death March went on for a full week. They marched in the night so that people wouldn't see them approaching Germany. The sisters took the cloth band from their striped Auschwitz frocks and tied their hands together. They'd stay together, dead or alive. They wore cheap wooden clogs, which were cold and slippery in the snow. They had no stockings or underwear. It's amazing they didn't freeze to death. If you lagged behind or showed signs of weakness, you were shot. And Nana said in her journal, human beings must be stronger than steel. They marched on until a place Nana will never forget. It was called Joachimsthal, Germany, and it sounded so similar to her last name, Joachimsmann. Perhaps a sign from their mother, already watching over them, she thought. Many of those who survived the march were killed upon arrival. They were taken to a station and put on trains. She was relieved because she felt she could walk no longer. This journey was in an open train station with no roof. The snow poured down on them. And again, flipping the situation to be positive, Nana interpreted this snow pouring down on them as a gift. She said, finally, something to drink. Once again, the sisters managed to avoid sickness. The train arrived in Ravensbrück concentration camp, a women's camp that had been built 13 years before, and they spent some days there. On the 1st of May, 1945, the final day of the war, the sisters were locked in the barracks, and for the first time, all was still. They couldn't hear any voices. The stronger Polish women, including Ruth, all pushed against the locked barrack door, trying to pry it open. No guards. All of the women stumbled out of the barracks and into the kitchen to find some food. And inside, a German was hiding. The stampede of Jewish women frightened him. He thought they were coming to kill him. He took his revolver and shot its 7 bullets. One lodged in Ruth's leg, but she was on a mission to find soup for Nana, her sister. She returned with cold soup and blood pouring from her leg. So you can see this theme of sacrifice and strength and sisterhood continue through the story. The sisters were taken to the nearest town where a Russian doctor could remove the bullet from Ruth's leg. By this time, she could hardly walk. And Nana also received some treatment for the dysentery that had developed in the final weeks of the war. After treatment in the hospital, they returned to Poland, completely unsure of whether their father was still alive, but knowing with quite certainty that they'd lost their mother. And because he'd been with Oskar Schindler, they came back to Krakow to the happy news that their father was still alive. The next line in her love letter reads, "Unfortunately, the joy of being reunited with our father didn't last long. And less than a year after the war, my sister was murdered by AK near Neuwied with 4 boys she knew. She was 21 years old and the boys were a little older than that. This last blow prompted us to leave Poland immediately. So we came to France, just the 2 of us, my dad and I." So this was the next huge challenge and atrocity in Nana's life, which was 1 year after the war was finally called off. Her sister and 4 cousins were heading to the Slovakian-Polish border for one of the high holidays. And Ruth was shot, having survived the entire war. So with no energy left to cope with any more of this, she and her father fled to Paris. And that's where the next chapter unfolds. So the love letter reads, "In France, 1947, the Polish Jews were said to have been doing fabulous business. Everything was going. It was only a bit of ingenuity and initiative. My father was too devastated, and I was too young, and I didn't have a tradesman mindset. By a lucky accident, he got into an important shoe company as an accountant, where he works to this day. In order to not be a burden, I set to productive work and thus rejected all ambitions I once had. I got married in the spring of 1951, having met a worthy and beloved man along the way of my life. From my short marriage, apart from my adorable little one, I only have memories of perfect happiness." So after fleeing to Paris, where her father had some family, at the age of 22, she fell in love with a fellow Polish Jew in Paris. This man you can see on the screen, Nathan Zaborowski. He was 14 years older than her and had a liver condition with a poor prognosis. And Roman, Nana's father, begged her not to marry him because of his poor prognosis and the likelihood that he would pass soon. But she describes feeling sorry for Nathan. She survived the war with her sister and her father, but he had no one. And at the time, this felt like a good enough reason to marry, as they did in the spring of 1951. And 11 months later, she gave birth to Vicky Ann Zaborowski, who's actually on the call today, which is exciting. Nana wanted to have as many children as she could manage in an attempt to forget the past. And the small family of 3 lived in what she says was perfect happiness with Roman for a little while. But again, the pain, she would not be without pain for long. So she says in her letter, "Unfortunately, I was left alone with a 6-week newborn. I was in too much pain. I couldn't allow this to continue. The first months I was completely numb, fulfilling my maternal duties without thinking, until the day when I, just in horror, heard myself humming a familiar melody. Even though I condemned myself in my heart with each day of hopelessness, I was eager to be close to privileged people who could laugh and rejoice. So after Nathan's passing, due to his liver complications, Nana received a letter from Melbourne. It turned out that they had a mutual friend between Nathan and Melbourne, to a man named Richard Montag. And we don't have enough time for me to tell his story as well, but as I alluded to at the start, Richard's story had been unfolding in parallel to Nana's story. He fled to Melbourne after the war and had been establishing himself there. And he heard that there was this woman who'd also survived the camps, a similar age to him, who was suddenly a widow with a 6-week-old baby. Now, the letter that he wrote to her from Melbourne to Paris has been lost along the way, but in my imagination, here's how it reads. Dear Judith, my sincere sympathies for the passing of your husband, Nathan. He and I shared a mutual friend who shared the news with me. My name is Richard Montag. Like you, I am a survivor. I have no family members and am building a new life in Melbourne. Australia is the land of opportunity. It's wonderful over here. I think you'd like it. I hope this letter doesn't make you feel uncomfortable. My hope is simply that we will write to each other for now. I will enclose my portrait so that you can imagine my face. Please write me soon, Richard. Upon receiving this letter, Nana didn't open it. I imagine it felt disloyal to Nathan, who had just passed, or unsettling to correspond with another man so soon after his death. And for months, she stubbornly held her ground. How could she open this? She didn't want to know what was inside. She had Vicky and Roman to care for. There was work to be done. The Jews were beginning to prosper in France. Her friend Marla said, far out, Judith, if you don't open this letter, I will. And this did the trick. She may have been hesitant, but the thought of another woman reading her letter was far worse. She swiftly found her inkwell and paper and wrote a 4-page reply. And in the week after her passing in 2021, this is the letter I found from Judith to Richard at Vicky's place. So the final paragraph of it reads, this is the story of my life in short and laconic words. And now, so you can more easily imagine the writer, here is my self-portrait. I have brown eyes, I am 1.60 meters and I weigh 57 kilograms. I am enclosing 2 amateur photos in which you, sir, will easily recognize the above specified deity. When it comes to character, I will only mention my flaws. I am a bit distracted, coquettish, and I do not have the gift of writing love letters, and then some French. Our tastes are maybe a bit different. I also like music and books, less sports, but apparently opposites attract each other. I am already tired of writing, so I wish to end here. I think I will get a reply soon with a more detailed description of life in Australia. I've heard all sorts of talks from people who are quite uninteresting. I would like to hear how you, sir, made your life there. For now, best regards, Judith. So for 8 months, Judith and Richard continued to write. He was slowly convincing her to take the significant journey across to Australia. He couldn't promise much. The generation of survivors started their new lives with nothing and had to build from there. But he was offering to take care of her and adopt her daughter, to support each other after a common, horrific past and attempt to smile once again. Thankfully, Richard was a fine convincer. He was able to acquire some money from Jewish Care, who were happy to bring more Jews to the growing diaspora in Melbourne, and this paid for Nana and baby Vicky to board the Fair Sea ship and commence the 5-week journey to Melbourne. The day they arrived in Melbourne, it was a boiling hot day, something she'd never encountered in Europe, so she was thinking, my gosh, where have I just arrived? Richard was there to meet them at the dock, and he brought them to this small dwelling above a shop on 156 Turek Road. Stashek Nyman, who had introduced them, organised this for him for little rent. So the next chapter began to unfold. Judith and Richard were married on the 18th of February 1954 on Turek Road, South Yarra. And whilst at first she said it felt like an arranged marriage, my father, their son, tells me that he can only remember love and happiness between his parents. Richard continued to work as a textile engineer, working on the machinery that made the garments. And Judith was becoming quite the fashion icon on Toorak Road, having brought modern Parisian taste to Melbourne with her. Roman, her father, who didn't make the trip over to Australia, would send her the latest Vogue fashion magazines, shoes and bags from Paris. And she'd dress herself and Vicky in beautiful frocks that she'd made by hand. And they'd be stopped multiple times as they walked down the street. Women wanted to know where she'd bought her dresses. And in response, she'd hand them a business card. And actually tonight, I know it's quite dark, but I'm wearing one of her blazers that I just picked up from Vicky's house a couple of days ago. I don't know if she made it or she just wore it, but I thought this would be special. So being a seamstress and bringing that Parisian fashion to Melbourne was a huge part of this chapter of her life, and I guess bringing some happiness in. So my grandparents worked hard, and by 1955 had saved the money to buy their first home at number 7 Fitzgerald Street in Paran, near the jam factory. And she soon fell pregnant with their first child and welcomed Mark in 1956. And then my dad, Ray, on the 2nd of May in 1963. As I encouraged my dad to reflect on his childhood for my research for this story, his early memories of Nana were the central figure of his family. They played to their strengths, Richard working and Nana leading the social entertainment side of things. At this time, takeaway dining was not so common, and Dad recalls eating at restaurants only very occasionally. Instead, everything was homemade. Their door was always open to friends to visit, and no one could resist Nana's beautiful cakes and Polish delicacies. She would patiently make her own pastries, broths, pickles, and jams, which we're all failing to replicate nowadays. This connected her to her desire to not waste any food at all. Many European immigrants from her generation shared this feeling, as they'd grown up with very little. If she ever noticed some fruit browning, or if the neighbours had spare figs on their tree, she'd whip them into a cake, a jam, a preserve. If Richard didn't finish a can of beer, she'd use the rest as hair conditioner. Dad would skip off to primary school with a very Polish lunchbox, while the other little boys pulled out their manicured white bread, cheese and Vegemite sandwich. Ray would present a rustic, thick rye that was black in colour, filled with some smelly French cheese and Polish sausage. If this wasn't enough to scare the other kids off, snack time did the trick, because Dad would have homemade yogurt in a reusable glass tub. Australia had not yet seen yogurt. When she wasn't cooking, Nana loved to knit clothing, beanies, gloves and jumpers for her family, using excess wool that Richard would bring home from his manufacturing job. And by 1971, she'd set up her very own dress shop in Mount Waverley. You can imagine that most of the Holocaust survivors battled with depression and PTSD for the remainder of their lives. And I understood that Richard's post-war depression was greater than Nana's. And in her take for Schindler's List, she describes herself as being strong in this regard. Nana wondered whether her husband had melancholy disposition, but suggested that his war experience certainly didn't help. She had to be strong for her husband. Her purpose became continuously propping him up, lifting his spirits, and perhaps this enabled her to ignore her own thoughts. They told their children very little about the war. I imagine that the reason was twofold. Reliving the story was too painful, and Nana felt that her story was no different to any other survivor, that there was nothing special to tell, except that she had survived. But whilst interviewing Dad for this story, I asked him how it felt to know that your parents were Holocaust survivors, but not have any knowledge of their story, really. Was he, Vicky and Mark, inquisitive? Or were they happy to go along without knowing, so that their parents could continue to build a new life? Dad explained that during his childhood in the 60s and 70s, very little, if anything, was discussed about the war at school, and perhaps he didn't quite grasp what had happened. He became a little more aware at the age of 14, when his father was too nervous to let him go on school camps. In fact, Dad didn't learn to ride a bike until Mum taught him at the age of 27, because there was a lot of nervousness and not wanting to take risks. He said he had to empathise with his parents and how they worried. They simply wanted their 3 children to have a happier life than they'd had. And Dad recalls them being very encouraging and supportive of his academic pursuits, always prodding him to do a little more homework and reminding him that education would be the key to a better life. let's go to her final chapter. So in 1978, Nana took on her final name, Nana Judy. One day, while she was babysitting her 6 and 4-year-old grandsons, they wanted to know what the ink on her forearm was. She said, "Oh, during the war, just for fun, they put these numbers on us." She thought one day when they were older, maybe she'd be able to tell them the truth. "If I live long enough, and if not, they can watch this tape," she said. In 1997, the year before I was born, after a long battle with colorectal cancer, Richard, my grandfather, passed away. In the previous chapter, I mentioned that caring for Richard and constantly lifting him out of his lows was Nana's purpose. Another Holocaust survivor, Viktor Frankl, has written extensively about the importance of purpose, including in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And without her purpose, Nana began to break down. She was alone and facing the demons that she'd bottled for 50 years. I was born a year later, and my early memories of Nana took place in her flat in Elsternwick. I remember trying on her earrings and long beaded necklaces. I remember sitting at the sewing machine together, making an apron out of pinberries on it. I remember sitting on her leather couch in front of the telly while she made a hearty meal. It would have been her famous slow-cooked goulash laced with paprika, or challah French toast on a Saturday coated in maple syrup and sugar. The extended family would gather to celebrate the main Jewish holidays over a long table dinner, and Nana would always argue that the soup needed far more salt, while my maternal grandmother, who is very health conscious, preferred a watered down vegetable mush. She would often make us laugh at the dinner table, especially when her audible chewing and chattering false teeth would put everyone else off their meal. In her final 15 years of life in a nursing home, it was clear to me that Nana didn't enjoy life so much. Vicky, her daughter, did everything she could. She became an employee of the nursing home, running fun activities that she knew her mother would enjoy, like bingo and bridge. We'd do our best to visit on a Sunday, sharing stories from our latest holiday or sporting event or school. On one visit, I thought she'd enjoy it if I played the beautiful grand piano in the communal space, but it only made her anxious that I'd damage the keys and she'd have to pay for it to be fixed. Such was the worrisome mindset of many elderly people in her generation. A popular visitor to the nursing home was my big Bernese mountain dog, Amber, who you can see in the middle photo there, Nana with my dad patting the dog Amber outside. There's just something about dogs, isn't there? All the residents felt really at peace around her. So there was an obvious shift from the end of 2019 onwards. Nana was finished. Nothing more could bring her joy or make her feel excited about another day. Her soul was ready, but her body just kept on going. For a 90-year-old, she was incredibly physically well. But when the mind is ready, nothing else really matters. On Tuesday, the 29th of June, she passed peacefully on what felt like her own terms. How incredible, I thought, for a 90-year-old woman who was once an 11-year-old girl that Hitler wanted to erase, to persevere and live a tough but colourful life and leave when she was ready. A family loss will always be difficult, but my dominant emotions are that of awe, gratitude, and happiness. I'm happy that she's finally at peace. I'm so grateful that she had the strength to persist and persist. I'm grateful that Victoria told Roman to quickly run into the other group before she was taken away on a train. And I think I'd like to reflect now on a lot of the lessons that I've taken from Nana's story. So often the normative discourse or the way in which we hear the Holocaust discussed is from a negative lens, and we can totally understand why that is, because so much of it was horrific and challenging. And so many of the things that the next generation and my generation think about these grandparents that survived is often about their worry and them always wanting us to be overfed and overdressed, perhaps that they can't let go of possessions because of that PTSD of having all of their possessions taken from them. But I would really love to end this presentation by thinking about some of the positives and the strengths that I draw from her story and how I apply them to my Olympic level sport and my medical studies and life in general. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm really interested to have questions when I wrap up, is this distinction between optimism and stoicism. So a number of points throughout the story, Nana talked about how without her sister Ruth, she wouldn't have survived, and how Ruth was always the optimist, always looking on the bright side, telling them to take one day at a time, and that Nana was more the pessimist. And I think the question of how some people were able to survive continues to enthrall us. There's a Stoic philosopher who I like to listen to podcasts on named Ryan Holiday. And he talks about Stoicism, and that often when we're tied to hopes or fears of an imagined future and an imagined future outcome, we're constantly let down. And this hope and this optimism actually killed a lot of people, because hoping that it'll be over tomorrow, or we just have to wait until Passover, or we just have to wait until the new year, when we're constantly let down by these fears of the imagined future outcome that we're ultimately not in control of, we lose the ability to persevere on our own terms. And I think we saw this a lot over the last few years as well. When we hope or fear, we're ultimately handing our happiness and our ability to continue on to some arbitrary event or person or thing in the future. And that's really exhausting. In fact, another Stoic philosopher, Seneca, in his moral letters, he says that it's ruinous for the soul to be anxious about the future and miserable in advance of misery, engulfed by the anxiety that the things it desires might remain its own until the very end. Such a soul will never be at rest. And in her book, The Choice, Edith Edgar, another Holocaust survivor, reflected that those who thought that everything would be finished by a certain day had greater despair and disappointment. So I try and apply this to life and to sport when I think about a careful balance of courage and risk-taking, creative thinking, and the capacity to just accept and commit to each day as it comes. It's actually talked about a lot in sports psychology at the moment, this concept of ACT therapy, where we accept things as they are. We don't expect to feel good all the time. We don't expect to feel positive all the time. We breathe and make space for what is, and we commit to the goal or the race or the exam tomorrow or what we're trying to achieve, and we go after it anyway. The next lesson that I really take from her story is about presence. And being mindful or present is perhaps something that you've heard all too much in the last decade, but the part in her story where in the Plaszow labor camp, she was really just looking forward to seeing her father at the dividing fence between the men's and women's barracks, hoping to have a simple exchange with him about, okay, we've gotten through one more day. Let's see what happens tomorrow. Here's a piece of bread that I've managed to steal. And that sense of presentness and one day at a time, I really apply firstly to sport. If I have a difficult training session, I try and think about one repetition at a time, 1 minute at a time. There's a quote that a lot of us use that says, run the mile you're in. And that helps you take something that seems overwhelming, like 20 kilometers of race walking, and bring it down into something that's far more doable. The next is about work ethic. So when I was speaking to you about the chapter of Judith as a mother, and how she was to my father, there was a real theme of encouraging hard study, perseverance, and trying to build a better life through work ethic. I saw it in Nana and my grandfather and the way they set up that jumper factory and worked their way up to opening her own dressmaking shop and owning their own place. And then the 3 children that they had, one of them being my dad, slogged away hour after hour through school and then through dental school. And now as a dentist, he never takes a sick day. And they've certainly passed that work ethic down to my sisters and I, who my sisters are studying medicine and dentistry, and we know that you get out what you put in. And we are so grateful and lucky to even be on this earth because of what Nana went through, that we do work really hard. The next idea that I take from her story is about calculating risks. So you heard time and time throughout that story, like when Roman was taken to one train and he saw the opportunity to leap onto the other, and go to the the labor camp, that was a huge risk, because if he'd been caught taking the jump, then he would have been shot then and there. When Nana was doing faulty work on the cable factory so that the insulation wasn't perfect, that was another risk where you could have been killed instantly, but you knew that taking the risk would maybe slow the Germans down. Stealing little bits of bread or trying to find out what was going on outside of the camps, all of these little risks that they were able to take in a calculated way, makes me really question every time I have a decision to make, where it might lead and what leaps are worth taking. Recognizing opportunities for others is another interesting lesson. I think back to that scene where Nana's parents, Victoria and Roman, were both put on the train destined for the gas chambers, and Victoria recognized the opportunity for her husband, and she said, "You're quite a bit younger than me and you look even younger in your face. Here is an opportunity for you to live, and for you to go to the labor camp instead. You need to take the leap." So I think that's a really interesting thought to ponder in our own lives today, recognizing opportunities for others. A very obvious one in the story is that Nana said time and time again that she wouldn't have survived without Ruth, and it wasn't just the optimism of Ruth, but physically through death march, as I explained, when they tied their hands together. And I think, I have two sisters now and they're my best friends, and just thinking about the strength of family, whether or not you have your wrists physically tied together, but feeling grateful to have them and for that bond is something that I also take from the story. And the last thing I take away is that, of course, life has its challenges. For all of us, we're starting a new week tomorrow, and there's going to be ups and downs, and there's going to be things that feel horrible. Like, for example, I've just recovered from COVID. That felt horrible. I've got an exam tomorrow and the next day. They're going to be challenging probably. I got a fine for my Mikey because I've been stupidly having a concession rather than a full fare. And all of these things feel like the biggest deal in the moment, or even if I'm about to start a hard training session. But a huge thing that I take from her story is to put everything into perspective, that life sometimes feels crappy and hard. But if we zoom out for a second and think, this is such recent history, just 2 generations ago before me, that people have lived through this atrocity. And so I'm able to flip situations and say to myself, I get to do this rather than I've got to do this. And I think that's a really nice thing if people want to take something away from tonight. It's not that we have to slog through all of these hard things in life. It's that we actually get to. We're really lucky to have the opportunity to be here living. And it's because of the strength and persistence and sacrifice of that generation of survivors that we have the opportunity. So I'd like to finish on that note. It'd be great if you have a question, if you came off mute and I could interact with you rather than being in the chat. So don't be shy and fire your questions away if you have any.
Jemima, that was amazing. You actually brought me to tears. It was just so beautiful. But I'd like to know about your Nana's bracelet and you wearing it in your race, because that for me was just such an important thing when I read about it. Can you talk about that bracelet and how important it was to race with it, please?
Thank you, Shirley. I can certainly talk about that. I should have talked about that already. The bracelets that you can see in the picture there, so those 3 hands are my sisters and I, and then Nana's hand in the bottom left corner. That was in 2019. And so my Auntie Vicky had a great idea that rather than waiting until she passed while she was still alive, she took a gold necklace that Nana used to wear and cut it into 3 for my sisters and I to have as a memory of her. And we did it while Nana was still alive and she still had 2 years left to live, so that she could see that memory being passed down and us always having her around our wrist. That gold bracelet now is not just a lucky charm. I used to be really into lucky things and quite superstitious, but I think it's simpler than that. It's just a constant reminder when I look down and see it glistening in the sun, or I feel it physically moving up and down my wrist when I'm racing. It's a reminder to think about her story and the strength that's in me. And again, gratitude for the opportunity to be here doing what I'm doing. And even if, you know, I'm halfway through the Olympic race in Sapporo and it's boiling hot and it's COVID, so no family are on the sidelines, I can feel that bracelet moving up and down my wrist. And it reminds me that as hard as this is, this sport thing is something that I'm choosing to do. And it's a privilege and it's an opportunity. And it's nothing compared to what she went through. And at the same time, there's that strength on my wrist. So when I crossed the finish line at the Olympics, I pointed to the bracelet and then up at her, because we'd only lost her 1 month prior, even less. And the bracelet is a really nice conversation starter and a really special thing to have from her.
Thank you so much. Most inspirational. Beautiful.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, we don't often have the opportunity of having someone with such depth and such emotion talk about this topic, both from the family perspective, but also from our own perspective. And I think I'm sure that some of you might have some questions, so please fire ahead. We've got a few more minutes. No questions? Jemima, I've got a question, if I may, and that is your endeavors in the area of the program that you're running with young women, girls. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the International Olympic Committee has this program. It's fairly new. And they picked 25 people from around the world to create their own sport-based project that would solve a pressing local issue in their community. So you had to pick something you were passionate about. And for me, that's the participation of women and girls in sport and recreation, because it's something close to my heart. It's something where we see a really big drop-off. Girls are dropping out of sport at twice the rate of boys when they reach late adolescence. And by the time they become women in our state of Victoria, one in 5 does no physical activity. And I guess through medicine, I'm learning a lot about how important that is for our physical health, but it's obviously important for our mental well-being as well. And I've also seen all of the great lessons that sport teaches us and how they lead to a more equal world for women and girls. And so the team building skills that you learn, the confidence, the self-awareness, all of these gifts that sport is giving me, I want to make sure that there's fewer and fewer barriers to other young women participating. So Play On has been piloting this year, and next year it'll be available if anyone is connected to a Maccabi or other sport club or school with 12 to 18-year-old girls as the target audience. You can arrange an Olympian to come and visit. I've got a group of 6 ambassadors who can visit your sport club or school and tell their story, their journey in sport, and offer access to a 4-module e-resource that takes the girls through 4 really important topics for staying engaged in physical activity. So yeah, if anyone's interested in a different topic, not what we've been talking about tonight, but they can certainly reach out to me about access in 2023.
Fantastic. So I'm going to try and join a few dots here and ask a question, and that is, obviously this has got a lot to do with the inclusivity theme of trying to make sport something that is like any other form of recreation, accessible and inclusive of all. And do you see any link between this and the lessons that you may have learned from your Nana about the Holocaust? Is there any connection in these?
I mean, I think she was an incredibly strong woman, and that definitely links to my passion for women and girls in sport, but it's not really about sport. It's about the lessons that we take from sport into life, into the workplace, into relationships, into life at large. So I think the strength that we see coming through in her story from her and her sister and her mother, and then her daughter, certainly tie into my passion for making the world a better place for women and girls through sport. And sport just happens to be my lens and my way of leveraging that. But I think inclusivity is also a really important theme, like you say, for Jewish people, and feeling that importance makes you think of other groups that are sometimes targeted or marginalized for other reasons, whether that be for physical ability or color or sexuality or gender. The Jewish community is a really special community to be a part of, but of course we feel anti-Semitism in small ways most days, even in 2022. And so experiencing parts of that does make you passionate about inclusivity for all sorts of groups, not just in sport, but in general.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, is there anybody else?
Karen's got her hand up. Is that
Sure,
a Karen
go
with a
ahead.
question?
It's actually Michael, Karen's partner here.
Next sitting next.
Hi.
How are you,
We
Jemima?
are together.
How are you, Jemima?
I'm
Jemima,
good.
I have a question.
Amazing presentation.
Yeah, amazing.
Jemima.
Very inspiring. I have a question. You've spoken a lot about your Nana's determination, right? To survive the Holocaust would have taken a huge amount of determination to just survive it, to get through it, to plan your life. You're obviously a very determined person yourself. We've watched you run. We've seen how determined you are. Walk, I'm sorry. Seen how determined you are, seen the determination on your face. Do you think that there's any element of genes and determination? Do you think that the determination of your grandparents, your grandmother, is something that might have come through genes to you? You're obviously a very determined person yourself. So what do you consider, where do you think that determination comes from? What motivates that determination? And what do you think in your background may have contributed to, obviously, your incredible determination in your own life endeavours, and particularly in your athletics?
Well, actually, I never introduced the other person on the screen now, but that's my first cousin, Adrian, who's the son of Vicky. So Nana is also his Nana. And he runs ultra marathons. And so I put his photo there next to mine at the Commonwealth Games, just to really exemplify the endurance athletes that have come just 2 generations after her. So I think in answering your question, which is really linked to those photos, there's got to be a combination of genetics and environment, nature, nurture. I would love to see some epigenetic studies done on the next generations of Holocaust survivors, and to see, I imagine there was genetic mutation and change that's been passed down in some regard. And I feel even just on a spiritual level, wearing that gold bracelet of hers and thinking about her story and knowing that I've come from her makes me feel like I have something in my blood from her, some kind of determination and strength, whether that's scientifically based or not. I'd love to see studies if they come in the future. But I also think, so that's the nature or the genes. In terms of nurturing and the environment, there's got to be something to say for role modeling that my dad and then Nana have given me. So from a very young age, watching the way that they worked tirelessly to build a better life and open up opportunities for their children and grandchildren must have also come in somehow to influence that determination. So I think it's a combination, but I definitely feel there's something intrinsic. And Adrian and I are just 2 examples of her grandchildren doing these sort of ultra endurance, strength requiring, determination requiring things. But yeah, I think that would be such an interesting PhD to do about epigenetic.
Well, they say that trauma is passed genetically.
Yeah.
Particularly, children and possibly grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So I'm sure there must be some link also with determination. But for that to be studied further would be...
Although not everyone acts on it.
No, that's right. But, obviously it's a combination of the genes and also the nurture. But, 100%. Just wanted to hear what you thought about that as well. So thanks for your response and
You're amazing.
Thanks for your address tonight. It was wonderful.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe that there may be one or two other questions, or
Come straight off mute, people, if you want. James.
Hi, I've got a question. Hi, Jemima.
Hi.
I mean, firstly, you are an inspiration. It was an inspiration to see you win, and I'm sure all these qualities will continue with you, and you'll continue to succeed. But my question to you is this: are your sisters, or do your sisters look to you for inspiration, or are you all very similar in that regard?
Ooh, interesting question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. Our sort of approach in the family is to really keep each other's heads small and to make fun of each other. And we rarely sort of would say out loud, you know, what you're doing is amazing, or you inspire me, or anything like that, because I think it's just an easier way to cope, just laughing at each other and more focusing on each other's flaws, which is sort of just a funny family dynamic. It's quite good to be a part of. But I mean, I'm the eldest, but Piper and Andy in their own right, you know, they're going to be a doctor and a dentist one day. And I think it's good, at least from a sport point of view, that we have each found our own distinct area and our own personality and ways to take up space. And so Piper, you know, medicine's really been a big passion of hers, and recently yoga has really taken over, and she's really enjoying exploring herself there. And then Andy ended up moving to Queensland to study dentistry and is finding independence and establishing herself that way, and being social and being fun and being creative. So I think we do each inspire each other in different ways, and we have found our own independence. But I don't think we'd ever sort of say it aloud. But I definitely back on that theme of sisterhood. Yeah, that relationship is really strong and really special. And it's got to be something connected to this story from Nana and Ruth, for sure.
thank you.
Right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think that this discussion could very easily have carried on for much longer. And on behalf of all of you, I'd just like to thank Jemima profusely for sharing with us her amazing insights, and wish her well in all her future sporting, academic, social justice, and familial endeavors. Like another incredible, world-famous and illustrious race walker, Dr. Shaul Ladani, Holocaust survivor and Olympic world record holder, Jemima's story is an inspiration and light unto us all. And I sincerely hope that this discussion will serve as a talking point amongst all those for whom Holocaust memorialization is so fundamental, and for those who share the hope and passion to make the world a better place for us all. Thank you all so much. Jemima, you were incredible. Thank you. Good luck for your exams and all the best with your recovery from COVID. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great evening. Thank you very much.